Hi, thanks for joining. Please make sure you subscribe to follow us on all the various platforms here on the podcast, as well as on YouTube. The stuff we write on Substack, as well as quick takes on Instagram and on Threads. If you're enjoying what we're putting out there, please make sure you're sharing with all your friends and family. And if you have questions or comments about the stuff we're putting out there, please make sure you leave them in comments to us. We'd be more than happy to cover them in future talks.
So I had a student the other day that came in and asked, what is it about the food dyes that make them so unhealthy? And then I had another student that was asking about why is everybody talking about not having sugars in the diet if we keep saying that sugar is an important part of everything we need in terms of metabolism. And I thought it'd be a good idea to kind of revisit and tackle again some of the myths that we have about foods. How true are some of these myths? What do we have to worry about when we start looking at these myths kind of shaping the way in which we view the chemicals and the nutrients we have in our foods? How true are some of these myths? And what should we hold on to? What should we ignore? Well, let's talk about that.
Warning. The following presentation contains information that might contradict what you have previously heard, or believed to be true, about how the human body works, and contains material that is not suitable for closed-minded individuals. Enjoy.
One of the biggest myths that we kind of always talk about, always tackle is the caloric idea as it relates to body weight and body composition, and the fact that if you are eating more calories than you're burning, you're going to gain weight, and if you're burning more calories than you're eating, you're going to lose weight. And what we have to remember is that weight balance and body composition have nothing to do with calories and caloric balance. It's all about nutrients and nutrient balance, and it's not about calories and calorie balance. It's one of the things that we've been talking about here on the podcast, as well as within the YouTube for as long as we've been doing these. It's something I've been talking about since the early 2000s in terms of the ideas as it relates to the overfatness issues, with first publications coming out in 2010 as it relates to the ideas of the overfatness versus the fitness continuum. One of the things that we have to keep harping on when it comes to that caloric balance issue, and why it's so difficult to get this kind of myth debunked, if we want to think about it that way, is the fact that it's so ingrained in everything that we have. And since it's so ingrained in everything we have, it's very difficult to debunk it, even though all of the research that's been coming out recently has shown that the focus of diet being on calories tends to lead to a lot of the eating issues that we see, because of the fact that we don't really understand energy and energetic balance outside of the health science community. Even in the health science community, it's not really well understood or well grasped onto. And so instead of looking at diet and looking at nutrition based off of calories and caloric balance, the thing that we should be holding on to is looking at it in terms of nutrient and nutrient balance. In this, we have to look at both my macronutrient levels as well as my micronutrient levels. When we start talking about macronutrients, what we're talking about my protein intake, my carbohydrate intake, my lipid intake, how much protein, how much sugar, how much fat am I having in a day relative to my body mass, relative to my metabolic rate. And even then, we now get the other kind of myth that's out there as it relates to diet, relates to nutrition, relates to foods, is that myth that people have fast metabolisms and people have slow metabolisms. And there's no real fast metabolism. There's no real slow metabolism. When we start looking at this idea about metabolism, one of the things that comes into play when we start looking at this idea about metabolism as it relates to the fast metabolism versus the slow metabolism is really an equation of body composition and what somebody looks like, and what they look like as the indication for their overall metabolic rate, which it's not true. And once again, just like with the caloric balance, we have to kind of ignore that as one of the myths that we should not be holding on to. And for a longer discussion on this, I'm going to highly recommend going back and listening to the initial discussions that Michaela and I had as relates to the fact that we don't burn calories in the nutrition aspect of everything, or even go back to the group talk, the science talk that I gave back at Manchester Community College back in, I think it was 2015 now, where I basically summarized all of the research, the meta-analytical research that showed that the most effective exercise and most effective dietary modifications that can be made as it relates to overfatness were the ones that were the least effective in terms of creating caloric imbalance. It's a point that I've furthered the research on, and other people have furthered the research on, looking at the fact that within exercisers, those that do not have drastic changes in caloric balance, or even more importantly, those that do not focus on a caloric balanced diet, ultimately have better body compositional changes coming from their diet and exercise regimen. So I will eventually get to the food dye discussion points here. But let's go ahead and let's delve into some of the myths and misconceptions that we have about, or I should say the myths that we have about sugars and carbohydrates. And so this is one of the ones that has become kind of hot button, if you want to think about it in terms of hot button, because we tend to now have sugars as being the boogeyman in terms of diet. And so sugar has kind of replaced fat in terms of public enemy number one, in terms of the consciousness that we have as it relates to our overall health and nutrition. And so there are a lot of myths out there about sugar. One of the ones that is most commonly discussed is the fact that sugar causes diseases to come about, and more importantly, they're referencing diabetes to come about. And the idea here is that since we're measuring elevated glucose levels or elevated sugar in the blood, sugar must be the root cause for diabetes. And if we actually look at the physiology of diabetes, or the physiology of metabolic syndrome, which is one of the things that I study a lot about, the idea here is that we're measuring symptoms of inflammation. So anytime we have any type of inflammation, anytime we have any type of health issue, sugar in the blood is going to increase. And that's because the cells that are fighting off the infection, creating the immune response, creating the inflammation response, are running on sugar. And so because they're running on sugar, they need more than normal sugar within the blood to run on those things, to run on the sugar, so that they're able to go about combating the inflammation, combating the illness or the infection that's causing the inflammation. And so sugar itself does not cause the diseases that we want to think about. And because they don't cause the diseases that we want to think about, the other myth that we have to kind of also ignore is that added sugar is dangerous. And this, once again, has become an excessively hot button topic in the realm of nutrition and health. If you look at any of the labels that we have in any of the food products nowadays, it doesn't just label sugars or carbohydrates, it now labels added sugars. And the added sugar, what we're looking at here is the fact that we have these experts telling us that we need to eliminate sugar from our diet because the added sugars is going to somehow trigger all of the metabolic disease issues. Not only going to cause all the metabolic disease issues, but the sugar is going to be the root cause for weight gain. And one of the things we have to go back in terms of our metabolism and looking at all of the aspects of this idea about added sugars being dangerous, or natural sweeteners being better than artificial sweeteners, which we'll talk about in a little while. One of the things that we have to remember is that in order to cause a weight gain, we have to have a nutrient surplus. In order to cause a metabolic effect, that molecule, that chemical has to be a metabolic disruptor, somehow has to impact metabolism in such a way that is going to cause a change in overall metabolism. And the sugar in itself doesn't do that. If we have too much of specific types of sugar, yes, we can have fat mass accumulate. Yes, we can have adipose tissue. Yes, we can grow fat mass from having additional sugar. But it's not the added sugars that are the harm that we're looking at in terms of the labeling. Most of the sugar that we have to worry about, that's going to be the root cause for causing the accumulation of fat mass that everybody's worried about as it relates to this idea about sugar and poor health, or sugar and gaining weight, is the high fructose corn syrups, the high fructose sugar syrups that we see within a lot of the mass marketed foods. But the problem with that is that by itself, we can't even stipulate that is the high fructose that's causing the issues, because there's so much in terms of potential metabolic disruptors within the foods because of the processing of those foods in between the farm and the mill and the bakery and the store shelf, and the store shelf and our mouths. And so because of all of the other processing that takes place, the food additives to the foods, the processing of the foods, may be more of a culprit than even the high fructose corn syrup, even though we do know that fructose by itself is going to be one of the stimulants that's going to cause fat mass accumulation. And so because we have fat mass accumulation going on, we want to have a cause and effect relationship, even though there is not necessarily a cause and effect relationship taking place. And so there are correlations that we do see in between accumulating intake, taking in more sugar and fat mass, but there's a whole bunch of other things coming into play where we can't specifically stipulate that it's sugar by itself. And so in terms of holding on to a myth about, particularly the myth about sugar being unhealthy or sugar being unsafe, a lot of that's coming into play as it relates to some of the dietary lifestyle modifications that we use for people who have diabetic conditions. And we extrapolate that since it's beneficial for the person that has diabetic condition, it must be beneficial for preventing diabetes. And that's not always the case. And once again, I would highly recommend going back and listening to, or going onto the YouTube and watching the what do we get wrong about diabetes discussions that we had. And so we have two myths that we know, or excuse me, three myths. If we look at the caloric balance issue, the fast versus the slow metabolism, and the fact that sugars are dangerous for us. Three myths right off the bat that we should not hold on to as tightly as we hold on to them. We shouldn't completely ignore them, but we shouldn't hold on to them to the extent that we like to hold on to those myths as being true. Another myth that people like to hold on to as relates to sugar is that sugar is addictive. Well, any food is addictive if it's going to trigger a bliss point response. And so sugar by itself is not an addictive substance, even though we do see changes in the dopamine pathway and serotonin pathway within our brain that are linked with addictive potential. But if it doesn't trigger the bliss point response, we will not see it as being addictive. And so for people who enjoy sweet and enjoys sweet foods, that sugar can have an addictive property to it. It can change some of the quote unquote brain chemistry that can lead to food addiction towards sugar, in the same manner that we like to think about, or at least I know a number of parents like to think about, as sugar causing hyperactivity within children. And once again, this goes hand in hand with this idea about sugar being addictive. And one of the things that we're doing is that we are associating behavioral responses with the idea that the thing that we're eating is causing that behavioral response. For children that enjoy sweet, and most children enjoy sweet because their metabolism is set up to run on carbohydrates more than run on all the other fuel sources that we have, they're going to enjoy sweet stuff. They're going to enjoy sugary stuff more than they're going to enjoy the other foods. And so they may want to eat more sugar stuff. And when kids eat things where they do get a bliss response, where they do feel happy afterwards, they may act out. Once again, kids be kids. And when we are kind of associate in a logical fallacy manner, the kid being a kid with the kid eating sugar, we're going to assume that it's the sugar that's causing the kid to act in a hyper fashion, when it's really just the kid acting like a kid. And it's not the sugar itself causing any type of hyperactivity within the child. It's more the fact that the kid is seeing the sugary substance as being a reward, for the simple fact that a lot of parents, a lot of adults will restrict sugars in their own diet, and by extension will restrict sugar in the child's diet. And they see the additional sugar foods as being a reward. And since it's a reward, they will have a reward response to that. And so, once again, we have these ideas of some myths that we should hold onto and some myths that we can go ahead and ignore in terms of the addictive property of sugars. If I am high bliss for eating sweet things, yes, I can have an addiction to eating sugar. But it's the sugar, but sugar itself will not become addictive. There's no withdrawal that we see from restricting sugar the same way that we see with other substances that form addictive things. It has to deal with the properties of addiction and what the properties of addiction do to our brain in terms of wanting that substance. What most people will point to in terms of withdrawal symptoms is simply is more often than not a hypoglycemic response to excessively restricting sugar from the diet for people where they're trying to remove sugars as it relates to the myth about sugar being addictive. In terms of the kid and hyperactivity, it's not really a myth. It's not really a misconception. It's just something where we're making a logical fallacy, a logical association in between kids acting like kids and the foods that we're allowing the kid to eat. What about sugars and fats in terms of causing fatness? And that's another myth that's out there, that if I eat fat, I'm going to be fat. If I overeat sugar, I'm going to be fat. And this is where we have to remember that regardless of what we've been told, the building of lipids, the building of fats, is based on the availability of metabolites for use in metabolism, the use of nutrients in metabolism. It's not about caloric balance. It's not about having too much sugar, too much fat in the diet. If I am overeating fat, or if I'm overeating sugar and I'm undereating other nutrients, the body is going to do chemical reactions in order to get the nutrients it needs from what I am eating in my diet. When it comes to making fats, what we call lipids, the process of making lipids is going to come about due to either taking a carbohydrate and turning it into a fat through a metabolic process, or taking smaller fat molecules and turning it into a larger fat molecule. The fats that we have in our body, the fat that we generate in our fat tissue in terms of what we are storing, doesn't come about from having too many calories in the diet, doesn't come about from overeating specific things. It comes about from having an excess availability of nutrients, with the exception of amino acids. Amino acids will not be converted into fat. Excess protein does not get converted into fat. It's excess amounts of carbohydrates, excess amounts of lipids that can be converted into fats. When we start looking at these fats, just like when we start looking at sugar in terms of the myths of too much, too little, etc., which remember is that it's not about the actual calories that we see in the diet. It's about the nutrient balance that we have in our diet. And this is where within the fats, and this is where eating fat makes you fat has caused due to dogmatic practices that one of the things that we covered in the Dogmatic Diets book as it relates to the low fat diet issues, is that there are fats that we need in our diet. And because of this idea of fat is going to cause me to be fat, we tend to eliminate a lot of fats. And one of the kind of myths that's out there is, oh, you need to sop up the grease on the pizza in order to eliminate the fat. Well, the fat on the pizza is going to be the healthier fats that we have there because they're the fats that have melted. The unsaturated fats are the fats that melt during cooking process. The unhealthy fats, put quotes around that, the saturated fats are the fats that burn. And so if you remember your mom or your aunt or even your sister or your brother or your dad or your uncle or your grandma or your grandpa's sitting there taking paper towel and sopping up the pools of fat that you see on the pizza as an attempt to make the pizza healthier, what they're doing is they're actually removing some of the healthier fats that we see within the meats, the monounsaturated fats and the polyunsaturated fats that we have in the meat under this guise that any meat fat is bad fat. That's going to cause me to be fat. And that's not always the case when it comes to fat causing me to become fat. The big misconceptions that we have regarding the health and dietary fat is that eating high fat diets is automatically unhealthy, that the cholesterol I have in my blood is coming from the cholesterol, it's coming from my diet, without understanding that most of the fat that we have in our body comes about from metabolic process that is going to attempt to store nutrients or is necessary to build the molecules that we need in order to stabilize things within our body, whether it be hormones or membranes for the cells or membranes for the tissues of the body. We need fats to build those things. The cholesterol molecules that we have in circulation, the LDLs, the HDLs, the VLDLs, that we like to associate with atherosclerosis, all of those things come about because of metabolism taking place in our liver, not the cholesterol that we're eating within our diet. Yes, people who eat more animal fat in their diet have a higher likelihood of having atherosclerotic changes, but that's more about immune response to antigens on the cell membranes of the animal proteins that we're eating, the animal cells that we're eating, more than the cholesterol issues that's there. And this is where we have one of the myths when it comes to the fat is that cholesterol in food triggers high cholesterol in my body. And that's not true. That's one of those ones that we can flat out ignore. When it comes to the myth about eating fat making me fat, we can, as long as nutrient balance is correct, we can ignore it. However, if I am in a nutrient surplus, eating fat can lead to accumulation of fat mass. But that doesn't mean I should be ignoring fats in my diet or cutting fats from my diet simply due to this idea of eating fat making me fat. And a lot of that idea about eating fat making me fat is the fact that we tend to think about fat as being ugly or fat as being something we don't want to see in terms of social recognition, social cognition about the fact that if someone has body fat, they are automatically somehow unhealthy, even though we do know for a fact that body composition itself is not an indication of overall health. And once again, I would recommend looking at the fitness and fatness discussions that we've had, or even the paper on fitness and fatness continuum, where physical activity is more of an important factor in that more than body composition happens to be. And this idea about the body composition idea and the eating fat making me fat or eating too much sugar making me fat is one of the problems that comes into play, particularly when we start looking at how healthcare professionals approach people who have body weight issues or express high amounts of body fat, where they tend to exhibit weight biases towards those individuals and tend to not treat the individuals until they lose body fat. That same idea about fat in terms of myths is that we burn fat during exercise and we don't burn fat sitting around. The use of fat, and then once this myth is completely bunkus, the use of fat for fuel source is at a higher use with lower intensity activities will use higher amounts of fat for fuel than higher intensity activities. Sitting around is the lowest activity that we can do next to sleeping. When we sit, when we're resting, we're getting around 70% of our energy molecule, or ATP, from use of fat for fuel. The idea that exercise is going to increase the burn of fat is one of the myths that we get because of the fact that we start sweating more. And we think that if we're sweating more when we're exercising, we must be using more fat. The fat max idea within exercise, and goes to the cardio zones that we covered just a few weeks ago, that you can catch either in the podcast or on the YouTube video. The idea about the fat max zone of that 50 to 60% and that 60 to 70% of your max heart rate comes about due to during exercise, because the intensity level is what it is at 50 to 70% of max intensity. I'm going to ramp up, I'm going to increase the fat use at that low end, and I'm going to maximize fat use in the most efficient way of regenerating ATP in that heart rate zone of 50 to 60% and 60 to 70%, which is where we get this. If you go to the gym and look at the little graphs on all of the machines, that fat burning zone that we get in our endurance training exercises. Yes, you will increase fat burning, but what's around that? Yes, you will increase the use of fat within the energetic pathways in those zones relative to the other zones. But that doesn't mean it's the maximum amount of burn, put quotes around that you're going to use within the day. And once again, it goes back to the body's going to attempt to make the most efficient metabolic pathways as possible to get fuel from the fuel source into its combustion network, into its network of metabolic processes. That's going to take the fuel and convert it into carbon dioxide and water to be released, with generating enough free energy to cause ATP to come back to the cell so the cell can do what the cells need to do. Which means that if we want to look at this fat burning idea, the maximum fat burning is going to come about when I'm sitting, not when I'm exercising. And so that myth is something that we can kind of ignore, with the caveat of, if I'm trying to exercise, however, the maximum fat burn during exercise is not when I'm going to be maximally sweating, maximally exerting myself. It's going to come when I'm at a much lower intensity. Now, in terms of body compositional changes, we want to actually be at much higher intensities in order to cause hormonal changes, in order to allow for the growth that we want to get within the body, so that we're able to maximally get the maximum amount of benefit from the exercise as relates to the body composition, which is a different aspect than the myths as it relates to nutrition and metabolism. Which takes us back to one of the initial questions that was raised in terms of what about the artificial sweeteners? What about the artificial dyes? Why is it that we keep saying that they're unhealthy for us? And the principal reason why we say that, and these myths are somewhat true, but not always true. For the artificial sweeteners, for the saccharin, for the sucralose, for the aspartame, for the stevia style artificial sweeteners, or even if you want to think about stevia as being a natural sweetener, those do not cause a lot of the issues that people think that they cause in terms of potential impact on overall health. There is correlation with increased fatness, increased overfat, metabolic issues for people who consume artificial sweeteners. It's a correlation, it's not a causation. There is increased inflammation that can take place. There is increased ROS and oxidative stress that can take place. There is an increased association with cardiovascular disease that can take place with the artificial sweeteners. But these associations are the same associations that we see with the high fructose syrups. And most of this has to deal with the fact that all of these sweeteners haven't the ability to act as a metabolic disruptor. They have the ability to change metabolic signals, metabolic pathways, to increase inflammatory hormonal signals and inflammatory metabolite signals, and reduce sensitivity to insulin, reduce sensitivity to leptin, reduce sensitivity to GLP, to increase sensitivity to glucagon, to increase sensitivity to cortisol, to alter sensitivity to adiponectin, all of which have an impact on my drive to eat, have an impact on my growth signals, have an impact on my metabolic signals, have an impact on my glucose homeostasis, have an impact on my lipid homeostasis, causing increase in lipids in the blood, having increase of cholesterol in the blood, having increases of glucose in the blood, having increases of inflammation throughout the body, which causes changes to my metabolism, which is where we get this association with cardiovascular disease, with metabolic disease, and these artificial sweeteners or natural sweeteners. As it relates to the food intake, and this is kind of a weird paradox here, even if I am not bliss point for sweet, that is, even if I'm not driven to want to have sweet foods, the artificial sweeteners, the sucralose, the aspartame, as well as the natural sweeteners that are not sugar, the non-nutritive sweeteners is usually how it's referenced. They all taste sweeter than normal sugar. Put quotes around normal, because all of them are normal things. They're all normally occurring things. Some of them are amino acids, some of them are sugars, some of in terms of being carbohydrates, some of them are sugar alcohols. Because they taste sweeter, they change my desire for food intake. They may not trigger an immediate insulin pulse, a spike in insulin, which is why they'll be used for people who have diabetic conditions, because we're trying to minimize the total insulin spiking that takes place. That's why people who are diabetic will be put on lower glycemic foods. And by be put on lower glycemic foods, it's an attempt to reduce the insulin spiking that can come from the foods that are being eaten. But what these sweeteners do is they cause a change in reward response, and they cause a change in sensing of metabolites being digested and absorbed. And what that change in sensing does, and what that change in bliss point reward response does, is it drives me to eat more food. And that's where we get this associated cause in between the consumption of the sweetener and the weight issue, the cardiovascular issue, the inflammatory issues. The other thing that these artificial sweeteners do as a metabolic disruptor is that they change metabolic signaling within immune cells and within adipose cells, which the fat cells, which triggers additional immune cell activity, which causes additional inflammation to take place. And so what the artificial sweeteners do in terms of the myths as them being unsafe is that they're going to trigger changes in my eating behavior and potential changes in my metabolism, where they can act like metabolic disruptors. Now, we have to put a big caveat on this. The amount of these sweeteners that we have to consume is so astronomically large that the sweeteners by themselves will not cause a lot of the harm that we tend to think they will cause. There is some evidence out there However, it's limited evidence, and it's evidence based on rodent studies and other animal model studies that there is a cumulative effect that the sweeteners have on metabolism. But we can't say it's true for humans because we haven't done the studies. We haven't looked at the long-term consumption of these sweeteners in humans as it relates to long-term health impacts. And so, once again, it's a myth that we can't completely ignore, but it's a myth that we should not wholly believe and hold on to as being true. Which is going to take us to the last one that we'll cover here in terms of the food myths and the metabolism myths. And that's the idea of the food dyes. When we start looking at food dyes, and this comes into why is it that the red dyes have now been quote unquote outlawed? Why is it that the yellow dyes have been outlawed? Why is it that the orange dyes have been outlawed? They're not really being outlawed, they're being banned. And there's once again, I'm not a lawyer, and so I can't distinguish between what the two of them happen to be. But we don't use specific types of artificial food dyes. And the reason why we don't use specific types of artificial food dyes anymore has to deal with what is the original source for the food dyes. And the original source for the food dyes are hydrocarbons, and the petroleum-based hydrocarbons for a lot of them. And because they come from petroleum-based hydrocarbons, they have the potential to have the same health risks that other petroleum-based hydrocarbons have, which is they can be both a metabolic disruptor, but they can also be an endocrine disruptor. And the combination of being a metabolic disruptor and an endocrine disruptor is that they can have the potential to be carcinogenic. That is, they have the potential to cause cancers. And so when we start looking at the food dyes, the artificial food dyes in particular, a lot of the artificial food dyes are being eliminated because of the fact that we see them as causing health issues. And the health issues we see them causing are cancers. And it's the cancers that we're trying to eliminate by eliminating these types of additives in the foods. And when we start looking at the food dyes in particular, what we're doing is we're looking at food dyes that have a hydrocarbon-based molecule that have a carcinogenic effect on the body. There are other food dyes out there. There are other food additives out there that are chemical mimics, that are endocrine mimics for naturally occurring hormones that can have an impact on reproductive health, reproductive physiology. BPA is one of them in terms of increasing the risk for reproductive cancers to come about. There are food additives that have an impact on dopamine and on serotonin that can cause changes in mood, can have changes in memory, can have an impact on our overall motor functions. There are food additives and food dyes that can actually have a reactive oxidative effect, can actually cause mitochondrial dysfunction to come about. There are food additives and food dyes that can have an impact on our microbiome. And one of the things that kind of comes into play within a lot of the nutrition myths, a lot of the diet myths, is this wanting to link all of the diet and all of the health issues that we have with our diet to our microbiome. And this goes into one of the things that kind of goes hand in hand with this idea about additives and artificial versus natural additives and health issues is the impact that these substances have on the microbiome within the gut. And from that, another myth that comes out that we'll talk about at the very end is the need, put quotes around that, for prebiotic and probiotic foods and substances or supplements within our diet. But the idea about food additives and the unhealthiness of food additives is really stemming from the chemical nature of these food additives. And because the chemical natures of food additives have the petroleum hydrocarbon base to it, it's going to have metabolic effects that are going to be endocrine disruptive in nature, that are going to be metabolic disruptive in nature. And because they're going to be endocrine disruptive in nature and metabolic disruptive in nature, we have to understand that the combination of the two is why that myth has to be held as true. Artificial food dyes, regardless of whether we like the artificial food dye or not, has a negative impact on our overall health. And this is where we have to start looking at, are there alternatives that could be a better choice? And this is where people will start selling, and I've seen it in the store, I'm sure all of you have seen it in the store, the naturally dyed sodas, the naturally dyed foods. And because we put in natural, it must automatically be quote unquote healthier, even though there's no indication that the dyes that are being used to replace the natural dyes are any better than the artificial dyes, with the exception of the fact that the natural dyes may not be petroleum-based hydrocarbons in terms of their foundational formula in terms of the shape of the molecule. And so we can't really say, oh, it's going to be this, oh, it's going to be that in terms of the natural versus the artificial dye, in terms of the food dye being better for us. But we do know that the artificial dyes can become problematic, and we should be kind of leery of foods that have excessive amounts of artificial food dyes. With the most recent of these artificial food dyes to face the kind of ban that we've seen with other food dyes is that red dye 3 or red 3 dye, in terms of the artificial food dye, artificial food coloring. And one of the things that we have to look at in terms of these food dyes is a lot of them are failing this generally recognized as being safe quality. And so these include things like red dye 3, red dye 40, yellow dye 5, yellow dye 6, blue dye 1, just to name a few. And within all of these ideas about the ban of the food, banning of the food dyes, a lot of them they've been banned, or we've known about the health risks for a number of years. And the health risks all stem from the root molecule that the food dyes are being based on. And we do know that these food dyes can have a negative impact on our microbiome. We do know that artificial sweeteners can have an impact on our microbiome. We do know that some of the things that we consume can have an impact on our microbiome. And that leads into the last myth that we'll try to tackle here, simply so I'm not talking for hours upon end. And once again, feel free to go back and listen to any of the other talks that we've had more specific to these ideas, is the idea about the prebiotic and the probiotic and its overall health. And the impact on this comes about from a lot of associated research, not really cause effect research, more correlated research, as it relates to inflammatory signals coming from our gut and how that inflammatory signal can lead to changes in our overall health. And so because there is this correlative effect, we tend to think about trying to offset negative effects within the gut by adding things to our food. And that would be the probiotic supplements or foods being beneficial to replace and replace or supplant any type of harmful bacteria that has outcompeted our beneficial bacteria within the microbiome, or that the nutrients contained within the prebiotic foods will allow for the microbiome, the healthy microbiome that we have, to produce the correct metabolites, produce the correct hormones, to offset any type of negative effect that they may have been having on our overall health, particularly through triggering chronic inflammatory signals that have been associated with gains in fat mass. Or we get this beneficial combination of the two, where we're going to supplant harmful bacteria or supplement the healthy bacteria by adding foods, particularly foods that are high in fiber, that is going to allow the bacteria to feed on in order to become more numerous, particularly the beneficial ones. Where the idea here is that the benefits that we get from these supplements, from these foods, is that it's going to improve our digestive health. It's going to try to create regular digestive movements. It's going to improve our metabolic fitness. It's going to improve our immune functions. Because we're improving our metabolic fitness, that's going to somehow help with reducing cholesterol levels. And part of that reduction in cholesterol levels has to deal with soluble versus insoluble fiber within the foods that we're eating, reducing the ability for the fat molecules to be absorbed, the changes in glucose levels within the blood, because we are changing our metabolic fitness and reducing our inflammation. All of these kind of ideas come about from the myth that we need these prebiotics and we need these probiotics in our body. The problem with this is that simply adding bacteria to the gut doesn't necessarily make the gut more efficient. Adding bacteria to our microbiome doesn't make our microbiome automatically healthier. And we have a wide swath of microbiome within our gut, within our intestines. And it is tightly regulated within there. And the supplement is only adding a few species of bacteria. And it's a few species of bacteria that is very easy to cultivate. And that by itself doesn't automatically give us a healthier gut and doesn't automatically make us overall healthier. And so the myth about the probiotic is kind of, I wouldn't hold on to it as true as what is advertised. But at the same time, I wouldn't necessarily ignore the prebiotic idea here. The prebiotic idea meaning that we need to eat more foods that are going to allow for the microbiome that we should naturally have to metabolize more correctly. And so that those two ideas in itself combined mean that we should maybe slightly ignore that myth about the prebiotic and the probiotic necessity for supplement, as long as we are eating what we should be eating. And so there's a lot of myths out there that we can continue to discuss. If you have other myths that you like us to discuss, please feel free to put it into the comments. We're more than happy to discuss any of the things that you want us to discuss within the idea about the myths and misconceptions that we have as it relates to diet, exercise, or any of the ways in which the body works in terms of the health that we try to set for ourselves. Thanks for listening. Hopefully you got a bit out of the discussion about the myths and whether we should ignore them or hold on to them. Please make sure you give us that big 5-star rating. Give us a big thumbs up. Let us know that we're doing a good job. If you have comments, please make sure you are leaving those for us. We're more than happy to address any of the comments in future presentations. Please make sure you're following us here on the podcast as well as on YouTube. The written stuff in Substack, as well as the quick takes that we post onto Instagram and onto Threads. Stay tuned for more talks as it relates to the misconceptions about diet and exercise, misconceptions about how the human body works, and how we can go about living a healthier lifestyle.